A lot of operations management decisions depend on a good forecast. You need to know what the demand is going to be in the future so the decisions you make prepare your company so that they can meet that demand. So when we talk about demand forecasting, we're talking about an estimate of expected demand during a specific future period. Well, what do you do with a demand forecast? Well, one of the uses for demand forecasting is to help you design the system. These would be decisions like what do we produce, how do we produce it, what kind of capacity, so how much do we need to be making, how do we design our facility, where is our facility located, what kind of machines and equipment do we need. So these are all in terms of designing how you're going to make your good or provide your services. We need to know what the forecast is to make these long-term decisions. So we're talking about designing a system. We need forecasts that are longer term. So what we mean by that is these decisions need, or these forecasts need to be 2 years plus. Okay. Now, it depends on your company and how flexible they are, that is how quickly they can adapt or change those decisions on how the facility is designed, capacity, things like that. Some companies are less able to adapt that, and so then you have to forecast even longer into the future. So for example, if we're Dow Chemical and we're making a decision about building a manufacturing plant, well, we're going to be stuck with that plant for decades. So we need to start looking decades out to forecast how much the demand is going to be for our product, so we make sure that what we build will do adequate production for what's needed. When we do demand forecasting, we're also using it to plan medium-term use. So in this case, we're looking at how much inventory, how many people in our workforce. So when we talk about medium term, we're talking about decisions that are 12 weeks to 2 years. So medium length term forecast. We need a forecast up to 2 years to make these types of decisions. We also need to do some forecasting for short-term use of the system, in which case our forecasts will need to be up to about 12 weeks of time. And these are decisions about purchasing our raw materials, when we schedule employees, and so on. So you may need to forecast long-term, medium-term, or short-term, depending on what you're going to do with the information that you're forecasting. Now, regardless of what period you are forecasting, there are certain features that are common to all forecasting methods. So the first is that we make an assumption that forces from the past will continue in the future. So let's look at forecasting the weather. Okay? When we forecast the weather, we assume that the same things that are causing the weather today are the same things that caused weather last week, 2 years ago, and will be the same things causing weather conditions 5 years from now. So the idea is that currents, moisture, those things dictate the weather, and so because the same forces from the past will continue in the future, we can use them to predict future events. We recognize that no forecasts are perfect. There will always be forecasting error. So we accept that. The goal is to minimize the forecasting error by choosing the appropriate forecasting method, and then to continually monitor the forecasting error and make adjustments in the future. We look at weather forecasting. Sometimes they say it will snow, and it doesn't snow. Over time, we improve the models for predicting the weather. We recognize that more general forecasts are going to be more accurate than very specific forecasts. For example, when we're looking at the weather, trying to predict the amount of rain or the amount of snowfall is less accurate than predicting the temperature. Temperatures are more consistent based on the time of year and the current patterns. We know generally what the temperature is going to be. We can be fairly accurate on it, but trying to predict whether this location is going to get rain or not, the forecasting error is much higher. So you need to look at how general can your forecast be and still be usable by your company to make strategic decisions. The last thing here is that forecasting accuracy decreases the further in time you are forecasting. So our forecasts on weather are more accurate if we're predicting this week than if we're trying to predict what the weather is going to be like months from now at Christmas time. So we'd like to have shorter term forecasts because they are more accurate. But then we have to look at what length of time is needed for our forecast in order for the company to make decisions. Which brings us back to the discussion we had before. Are you forecasting to help with designing your system? In which case you're going to need longer forecasts. Or are these forecasts to help with more short-term scheduling, raw materials, employees, and so on? So what we're really looking at is the forecasting horizon, which is the range of time that we are forecasting for. Short term, medium term, long term. Now, as you are looking at how long your forecasting horizon is, there's a benefit for it being shorter because it's more accurate, but it also needs to be long enough for the company to make the necessary decisions for its operations. So we want to know then is how flexible is your company? How easy can your company adapt to changing conditions? A company that is more flexible can live in the short term. If your company is able to adapt quickly to changes in the market, then your forecast can be much shorter, in which case your forecast will be much more accurate. If your company is not flexible, and you're not flexible because of your infrastructure, maybe basically you're using very specific machinery, it only does one thing. Because of the way you're producing, you can't really change your capacity or how much you're producing. It can't be expanded without incurring a lot of cost or expansion. Then you're not very flexible. You can't adapt quickly to changes in the market. So if you're not flexible, you're going to need a longer horizon. And the difficulty with that is that the longer out you are, the less accurate you tend to be. And so this can be a big risk for these companies who can't quickly adapt or change in terms of how accurate the forecasts are that they need. So what makes a good forecast? Good forecasts are timely. Okay, so we want to be able to forecast in a period that is relevant to us. So what good is a forecast that can only forecast 2 minutes ahead in time? We can't make any decisions or change our behavior based on that. So we need a forecast that can forecast the length of period necessary for the type of decisions we're making. We need our forecasts to be accurate. Right? It matters whether your weather forecast is 2% accurate or 90% accurate. You know whether you can trust it. You know whether it changes your behavior, like what you wear for that day. So we need to be reliable. Do you believe your forecaster if they're only right like 50% of the time? So you need it to be trustworthy in terms of we can have faith in what's being forecasted. So Punxsutawney Phil, right? Groundhog Day. Have you heard of Punxsutawney Phil? How accurate do you think Punxsutawney Phil is at predicting whether winter will continue or whether we'll have an early spring? Well, it turns out that Punxsutawney Phil is only right 30% of the time. That's less than a coin toss. It'd be more accurate to flip a coin to predict whether or not winter will continue than it is to ask the groundhog. So we need a forecasting measurement that's reliable, that we can have faith in and then utilize. When we have a forecast, it needs to be in meaningful units. So for example, it doesn't make sense for the weatherman to forecast the temperature in degrees Kelvin, right? We don't use that, we don't understand it. It's a measurement used in science and not in everyday conversation. So it's not very meaningful to us. We need our weather forecast to be in a measurement we understand, Celsius or Fahrenheit. We need a good forecast to be in writing, right? We need to be able to see what that forecast is so that we can use it. It needs to be something that can be used by all parts of the organization. So whenever a forecast is done for a company, it should be in some kind of documentation available to the entire company so that decisions made throughout the organization, both by upper management for strategies, as well as operations for day-to-day scheduling, as well as finance for making decisions on investing in equipment. Everyone needs to be using the same forecast. So it needs to be in writing, it needs to be available for everyone. Which means it also needs to be simple to understand. And to use. So it needs to be something that we can understand where the numbers came from, how they got them, and what that means for the company. We're going to look a little later about some super complicated formulas. The more complicated your forecast calculations, yes, that can increase accuracy, but it can also make it really hard to explain why these different changes are occurring. So you often trade off a bit of the accuracy in terms of simple to understand and to use. We need a method that is cost effective. Those super complicated forecasting methods can use a lot of time, can require experts, can be very expensive. And so often we trade that off for something that's a little bit simpler for saving. So we have to look at that kind of trade-off between accuracy and cost. We want to be as accurate as possible, but sometimes high levels of accuracy create too much complication, so we can't explain to our stakeholders what it means, and then it ends up costing us too much money in terms of constructing that forecast.